As the land is cleared, it's also going to be tamed by the farmers who are coming in and turning that land into farmland. At first, agriculture booms, but by 1890, we're producing so much agricultural prices fall and farmers are struggling. The railroad, of course, is a main key, as that's what these red lines are railroad lines, because that's how you get out to the west to start this new life. State governments and the federal government will give enormous amounts of money and land to corporations for free to get them to build the railroads. This is all a giant government subsidy program. A lot of times people will talk as if the big government was invented in the New Deal. That's not true at all. It was invented by the Republican Party in the Civil War and the period after the Civil War through things like the railroad program. 50 million acres will be given away to railroad companies by state governments. 130 million acres will be given for free to railroad companies by the federal government. The railroad promotes settlement with cheap tickets and cheap land. In the 70s and 80s, the rainfall was good, the soil was fairly untouched, and farm prices were high, and people did really well. There were challenges. The lack of trees, the Great Plains is called that because there's really no trees on it, made building fences difficult. In areas with lots of trees, you just cut the trees down and you make wood fences. And so the plains won't be able to successfully really be conquered until the invention of barbed wire. Two guys, Glidden and Elwood, will invent barbed wire separately. Another problem is the lack of water. And so they will dig deep windmill wells, so very, very deep wells, with windmills to pull the water up. Dry land farming, this is where you water the ground and then you put a layer of dirt over the watered ground to keep the soil from evaporating in the heat. They grow drought-resistant crops, and sometimes that means crossbreeding crops until you make a variety that doesn't need as much water. What they really need is large-scale irrigation, but unlike the giant transcontinental railroad, which is done by large corporations, the government is unwilling to subsidize irrigation for individual farmers. When the rain stops in the 1890s, the farmers are destroyed. Farmers live in debt constantly. You borrow the money now to get through the next crop. And so if you start to have bad crops, you can't pay off your debts, you lose your land. And in the 1890s, we'll see a massive reverse migration as people will be moving from the west, from the Great Plains, back to the east, creating ghost towns and abandoned farms throughout the west. The price of wheat was $1.60 in 1870. In the 1890s, it will fall to 49 cents. So that means you have to grow more than 3 times as much of the crop to have the same income that you had 20 years earlier. Commercial agriculture will replace the family farm. Cash crops are sold all over the world. Once the farmers in the 1890s begin to lose their farm, large corporations will come in and buy up all that land that's being sold cheap. You didn't make your... this was a system where we're growing largely crops and then selling them and buying what we need. This is not a lot of subsistence farming. Farmers didn't make their stuff so much anymore. They bought it from things like the Sears catalog, which we'll look at later. They were dependent on banks and interest rates and the rates that railroad charges and the shipping rates and the international markets. What's going on in Europe is affecting a farmer in say, I don't know, Idaho. And farmers lost control and lost any understanding of supply and demand. In the 1880s, worldwide agricultural production begins to go up and up thanks to increases in technology. And if agricultural production goes up because of supply and demand, prices go down, and the 6 million farm families in America are going to be severely hurt by this. By 1910, 20%, in the 1890s, 20% of farm families are mortgaged to try to stay alive. By 1910, that number has gone up to a third. In 1880, 25% of farms are operated by the people who own the land. By 1910, 25% of farms are not operated by people on the land. They're tenant farmers. By 1910, that number is up to 37%. A few farmers got very rich and created large farming empires. Most farmers just got poorer and poorer in the 1890s and 1900s. Farmers are unable to understand global supply and demand. They hate the railroads because of the high rates of freight. They hate the banks because of the high interest rate. And they believe that the problem is there's not enough money into circulation. Farmers demand inflation. Railroads charge different rates by region or crop. So they'll charge one person something for growing wheat and a different person something for growing corn. They control the grain elevators where the wheat is stored when it's before it's shipped, and the warehouses where it ends up after it's shipped. and they price gouge. The banks charge 10 to 25% interest on farmers, and as farm prices fall, nobody can pay their debts, and people lose their farms in huge numbers. The farmers will come to believe that the railroads, the banks, and the eastern businessmen were intentionally inflating prices at planting time to make loans at high rates, and then dropping the prices at harvest time, so when the farmers go to sell their crop, they don't get anything for it. And this was true. This was a giant scam being perpetrated by these large corporate interests on the farmers. They jack prices up at planting time and then drop prices at harvest time. Manufacturing is not as affected due to world markets because the politicians have put huge tariffs on manufactured goods, but those tariffs didn't exist on farm goods. So the government is protecting the manufacturers, but not the farmers. So when the prices dropped, the things the farmers needed to buy, those prices remained high because they were protected by tariff. And this further added to the crisis of the farmers. We're going to look at the politics of this in a couple of chapters down the road when we talk about the Grange and the populist movement.